You know, we've all been there, right? You're staring at pages and pages of terms and conditions, and you just scroll right past it all to click that little I agree box. But what are we actually agreeing to? Well, today, we're going to dive into that infamous fine print and figure out when those sneaky little clauses, the ones that limit a company's responsibility, are actually legally binding.
So, picture this. You just bought a brand new, super shiny gadget. You're loving it. But a week later, it just stops working. So you get in touch with customer service, and they hit you with this. Oh, sorry, but as per Clause 23C of the terms you agreed to, we're not liable for this. It is so frustrating, isn't it? It feels completely unfair. But are they right? Are you really just out of luck?
So what you've just run into is something called an exclusion clause. It's a very specific part of a contract that's designed to do exactly what it sounds like: exclude or limit one party's legal responsibility when something goes wrong. And trust me, they are everywhere, from the software on your phone to the contract for your gym membership.
And that really brings us to the big question, the central puzzle of this whole explainer. What actually makes one of these clauses stick? Is clicking that I agree button really an unbreakable promise, or are there, rules they have to follow? Well, it turns out there are, and it all boils down to a pretty simple three-part test. Okay, so the very first hurdle any exclusion clause has to clear is what we call the test of notice. And it's a simple question. Were you properly told about this clause before you sealed the deal?
So in legal speak, notice just means a company can't bury some critical term and then, spring it on you later. They have to have made you aware that it exists either before or at the very moment you enter into that contract, not a second later. And this can happen in a couple of different ways.
Basically, notice comes in two flavors. First, you've got actual notice. This is the really obvious stuff. Someone literally points out the clause to you, or you have to put your signature right next to it. Then, on the other hand, there's something called constructive notice. This is a bit more indirect. The law basically says, hey, if the clause was presented in a reasonable way, like on a big, clear sign at a code check, then a reasonable person should have seen it. Burying it in tiny gray font on page 37 of a website, that's probably not going to. All right, so let's say they gave you notice. You knew the clause was there, but what good is that if you can't even understand what it's trying to say? Well, that brings us right to our second test, clarity.
Just take a look at this. I mean, wow. This is the kind of legal jargon that makes your eyes just glaze over. What even is malfeasance? If a clause is so confusing or packed with technical language that you'd need a lawyer and a translator to figure it out, it just might fail the clarity test. Courts are really not big fans of clauses that seem deliberately confusing.
Now, compare that monster of a sentence to this. We are not responsible for any damage to your property. See? It's clear. It's simple. There's really no room for argument. To be legally valid, an exclusion clause has to be unambiguous. It needs to say exactly what liability it's limiting in a way that a normal person can actually understand.
Okay, let's just hit pause for a second and recap where we are. We have our three-point validity check. Number 1, was there proper notice? Number 2, was the language clear? And that brings us to the third and final piece of our puzzle, scope.
I want you to think of an exclusion clause as a kind of legal umbrella. For it to actually protect a company from a downpour of liability, that umbrella has to be big enough and specific enough to cover the exact problem that happened. This is what we call the test of scope.
So here's the deal. The wording of the clause has to be wide enough to cover the specific thing that went wrong. For example, let's say a dry cleaner has a clause that says they're not responsible for damage to buttons. Okay, fair enough. But they can't use that same clause to get out of it if they lose your entire suit. Why? Because the clause's scope only covered damage to buttons, not total loss. The clause has to fit the crime, so to speak.
So, there we have it. We've looked at all three essential pieces of the puzzle: notice, clarity, and scope. Now, let's go all the way back to our original question and put it all together to get the final answer.
So what's the final verdict here? For one of these clauses to actually be legally binding, does it just need to pass one of these tests? Is just giving notice enough? Or is it all about clarity? Or maybe the scope? Or is there something more to it?
And the answer is all of the above. It's not a multiple choice question where you just get to pick your favorite. No, it's a checklist, and every single box needs a check mark.
And honestly, this is the most important thing to take away from all this. It's not a mix and match situation. An exclusion clause has to pass all three of these tests to be considered valid. It has to have been properly brought to your attention, it has to be written in clear, understandable language, and it has to be wide enough to cover the exact thing that happened. If it fails on even just one of those points, its validity can be challenged. So, the next time you find yourself scrolling through a long page of terms and conditions, you're not going in blind, you're armed with new knowledge. That fine print isn't just a formality, it's a set of rules that has to play fair, and now you know exactly what to look for.